As the Pacific War raged on, the island of Ambon became the setting for one of the most chilling atrocities committed by Japanese forces. Following their capture of the island, they sought vengeance for the destruction of one of their minesweepers. In retaliation, more than 300 Australian and Dutch prisoners of war were randomly selected and executed near the airfield, their lives brutally ended by beheading and bayonet. This horrific massacre was not a singular act of cruelty, it was repeated 3 more times that month, each execution site becoming a grim testament to the suffering of the helpless captives. The magnitude of the atrocity was so severe that, after the war, an Australian military tribunal sought justice. More than 90 Japanese officers and soldiers stood trial for their roles in the massacre. The court sentenced for 2 deaths, while others received various sentences, ensuring that at least some perpetrators faced consequences. However, Rear Admiral Hatakeyama, the true mastermind behind the massacre, never faced justice. He died while awaiting trial, escaping the reckoning that should have befallen him. As the war continued its ruthless march across the Pacific, yet another ghastly event unfolded on the eve of the British surrender in Singapore. Alexandra Military Hospital became the scene of unthinkable bloodshed when Japanese soldiers stormed its halls, indiscriminately slaughtering patients and medical staff alike. Even those in the midst of surgery were not spared. The few who survived the initial massacre were forced to clean the blood-soaked floors before being herded into cramped rooms. Their suffering did not end there. By morning, 200 remaining prisoners were marched into the courtyard and mercilessly bayoneted to death. The hospital, once a place of healing, had become a house of horrors. In the aftermath of this senseless carnage, a brief attempt at justice followed. General Yamashita, upon learning of the slaughter, took swift action. He ordered the execution of those responsible, a rare instance of discipline within the chaos of war. Yet, no punishment, however severe, could ever erase the horror of that night. The echoes of suffering lingered in the halls of Alexandra Military Hospital, a stark reminder of the depths to which humanity could sink in the throes of war. On Palawan Island in the Philippines, American prisoners of war languished in captivity, their futures uncertain. The Japanese, fearing an imminent Allied invasion, viewed these prisoners as a liability rather than captives of war. In December 1944, a grim decision was made: the Americans were to be exterminated. Under the pretense of protecting them from aerial bombardment, the Japanese forced the prisoners into cramped air raid shelters dug into the ground. Moments later, guards doused the entrances with gasoline and set them ablaze. Trapped inside, the prisoners were engulfed in flames, their screams swallowed by the inferno. Some managed to claw their way out, their bodies charred and smoking, only to be met with bayonets, bullets, and clubs wielded by waiting soldiers. A handful of prisoners, driven by sheer survival instinct, made a desperate dash toward the shoreline, hoping the sea would offer an escape. Some dove into the water, swimming blindly in the darkness, their bodies racked with pain and exhaustion. The Japanese, relentless in their pursuit, hunted them down, dragging many back to shore to face brutal executions. Yet, against all odds, fewer than a dozen men evaded capture, swimming across the bay to safety. Exhausted but alive, they bore witness to the horrors they had escaped, their testimonies fueling Allied determination. News of the Palawan massacre spread quickly, igniting a series of retaliatory raids and accelerating efforts to liberate prisoners still held across the Philippines. Far from the carnage of Palawan, another horror unfolded on the remote island of Nauru. Japanese forces had seized the island in 1942, cutting off its inhabitants from the outside world. When American bombers attacked the Japanese airfield in March 1943, the occupying forces sought retribution, selecting 5 Australian internees and publicly executing them by beheading. But this was only the beginning. That same year, in a desperate attempt to stretch their dwindling rations, the Japanese rounded up over 1,000 indigenous islanders, forcibly deporting them as slave laborers to distant lands. Families were torn apart, their fates unknown. Many would never return, their names erased by time and cruelty. Perhaps the most chilling atrocity on Nauru was the eradication of its leper colony. Seen as a burden, the Japanese devised a disturbing solution. They rounded up all 39 lepers, herded them onto a boat, and took them out to sea. Under the open sky, far from the shores of their homeland, the helpless men and women were gunned down in cold blood. Their lifeless bodies sank beneath the waves, vanishing without a trace. Where a colony had once stood, there was now only silence, a haunting void left in the wake of unimaginable cruelty. The waters of Nauru held their secret, a grim testament to the inhumanity of war. The Japanese destroyer Akakazi cut through the waters of the South Pacific, its engines humming beneath a deadly silence. On board, a group of German missionaries and Chinese civilians, men, women, and children, stood under the watchful eyes of their captors. The Japanese suspected them of espionage, though no evidence had been presented. Their fate had already been decided. One by one, soldiers led them to the stern of the ship, where the executioners awaited. Their wrists were bound tightly behind their backs, their bodies subjected to brutal whippings before the final act of cruelty. Gunshots rang out, the sound swallowed by the vast expanse of the ocean. Their lifeless bodies were cast overboard, vanishing into the abyss. The executions continued for 3 relentless hours. The sea, indifferent to the horrors unfolding above it, became their grave. Among the victims were 2 children, whose cries for mercy were ignored. No exceptions were made. The ship's engines roared, drowning out the last echoes of their suffering. By the time the killings ended, all 60 captives had been wiped from existence, their only crime being suspicion. The Akakazi sailed on, leaving no trace of the massacre it had just carried out, its crew complicit in one of the many atrocities that marked Japan's brutal reign in the Pacific. Far to the west, another crime unfolded on the high seas. The British merchant vessel Bihao, unaware of its impending doom, found itself under attack by the Imperial Japanese Navy. The heavy cruiser Toon, commanded by Captain Haru Mayuzumi, unleashed its firepower upon the defenseless ship, sending it to the depths. But this was not the end for its crew and passengers. Over 100 survivors were pulled from the wreckage and taken aboard. Mayuzumi, believing he had fulfilled his duty, reported his success to his superior, Rear Admiral no Masasakanyu. However, instead of praise, he received an order that chilled him. No prisoners were to be taken. The survivors were to be executed. Mayuzumi hesitated, pleading for their lives, but his protests were meaningless in the face of Sakanju's cold resolve. With no choice, he divided the 108 survivors into 2 groups. A handful of officers were spared and set free, but for the rest, there would be no mercy. Under the cover of darkness, the executions began. One by one, the captives were slaughtered, their bodies discarded into the sea like refuse. Justice came too late. After the war, Sakanyu faced trial and was sentenced to death by hanging, his name forever stained by the massacre. Mayuzumi, despite his reluctant compliance, received only 7 years in prison, a small price to pay for participating in an atrocity that had erased so many innocent lives. Following the fall of Singapore in February 1942, the Japanese sought to crush any potential resistance before it could take root. The secret police, the Kempeitai, orchestrated Operation Sukching, meaning purge through cleansing, a campaign of systematic mass executions targeting the Chinese population. Every Chinese resident became a suspect, regardless of age or allegiance. Men were rounded up in droves, paraded before informants who merely pointed a finger to seal their fate. Suspected resistors, intellectuals, and those with nationalist ties were among the first to die, but the killings did not stop there. In rural villages, entire communities were wiped out based on nothing more than suspicion. Forced to dig their own graves, the condemned were lined up and shot, their bodies left to rot in mass graves or washed away by the tides. The true scale of the massacre remains uncertain. Japanese records estimate between 5,000 and 6,000 deaths, but local accounts paint a far darker picture. Survivors and historians from Singapore and China claim the number could be as high as 100,000, with the dead buried in unmarked sites across the country. Families were shattered overnight, and the once thriving Chinese community of Singapore lived in perpetual fear. No one knew when the Kempeitai might strike again. By the time the bloodshed subsided, the city stood as a silent witness to its own suffering, its streets emptied, its people broken, its past erased by the cruelty of occupation. While the land bore witness to Sukching's horrors, the sea became another graveyard at the hands of the Japanese submarine I-8. On March 26, 1944, the sub encountered the Dutch freighter Sealek and an armed vessel carrying civilians and crew. After torpedoing the ship, the I-8 surfaced and took 103 survivors on board. But instead of mercy, they were met with an unthinkable fate. One by one, the prisoners were subjected to unimaginable brutality, beaten with sledgehammers, hacked apart with swords, and mutilated beyond recognition. The ocean, stained with their blood, bore silent witness as their broken bodies were discarded. Those still clinging to life were bound together and forced to lie on the deck. Then, without hesitation, the submarine dove, dragging them down into the abyss. A few months later, history repeated itself. The American cargo ship Jean Nicolet crossed paths with the I-8, and knowingly sailing toward doom. After sinking the ship, the Japanese lured the 100 surviving crew members onto the submarine. They were made to run a gauntlet of blades stabbed, slashed, and beaten as they stumbled forward, their agony a source of entertainment for their captors. Those who survived the ordeal were thrown into the ocean, left to either drown or be devoured by sharks. As an Allied aircraft approached, the I-8 made a hasty retreat, submerging with 30 prisoners still bound on its deck. They never resurfaced. Only 2 dozen men lived to tell the tale, their bodies scarred by the horrors they endured. The ocean, once again, became the final resting place for the forgotten victims of war. Deep in the jungles of Burma and Thailand, thousands of prisoners faced a slow and merciless death at the hands of their captors. The Japanese sought to build a 415-kilometer railway to reinforce their supply lines, a feat they intended to accomplish with sheer human suffering. They enslaved 60,000 Allied prisoners of war and forced 200,000 Asian laborers into a brutal existence. Under the relentless sun and suffocating humidity, men worked through exhaustion and disease, driven by the constant lash of their overseers. The slightest sign of weakness meant a swift and merciless end. Malaria, dysentery, and malnutrition claimed countless lives, while those who lagged behind felt the sting of the bayonet or the butt of a rifle. The bridge over the River Kwai, made famous by later accounts, became a symbol of their torment, a monument to the suffering etched into the land. By the time the railway was completed in late 1943, it had become a graveyard for those who built it. Over 13,000 Allied POWs perished alongside an estimated 100,000 Asian laborers, their bodies buried in shallow and marked graves along the tracks. Yet even with the railway operational, the torment did not cease. The Japanese forced surviving prisoners to maintain and repair the tracks, ensuring that death remained an ever-present shadow. Those who survived the ordeal bore scars, both visible and unseen, their minds forever haunted by the cruelty they endured. The railway itself stood as a silent testament to human endurance and suffering, a path paved with the bones of the forgotten. But no single event in the Pacific War matched the destruction witnessed in Manila. As American forces advanced in early 1945, Japanese troops found themselves trapped within the city's confines. Rather than surrender, they turned their fury upon Manila's people. For nearly a month, hell reigned in the once thriving capital. Japanese soldiers, knowing their fate was sealed, unleashed a campaign of systematic terror. Entire families were massacred, women were brutalized and slaughtered. Hospitals and churches, places of sanctuary, became killing grounds where the wounded and the weak met the same fate as the strong. Machine guns tore through crowds, and entire districts were set ablaze with civilians still inside. The city, which had once been the Pearl of the Orient, became an inferno of suffering. American troops, witnessing the horror unfold, initially held back their artillery, hoping the Japanese would surrender. But their enemy had no intention of laying down their arms. They fought to the last man, taking 100,000 civilians with them. By the time the battle ended, Manila lay in ruins, its people decimated. Only Warsaw had suffered greater devastation during the war. When peace finally returned, it was an empty victory for the survivors, who stood among the ashes of their homes, their loved ones reduced to memories. The war had ended, but its scars never faded. Justice was served to some, yet thousands of perpetrators vanished into history, their crimes buried beneath the rubble of war. What remained were the echoes of their deeds, a haunting reminder of humanity's darkest depths. Thanks for tuning into the past. Don't forget to subscribe and join me for more stories that shaped our world.